Hello everyone and welcome back to the Colour Cave. My name is Jem and today I would like to tell you a story. So just you sit back with your tea or your coffee and possibly something stronger if you're that way inclined, and you can relax while I sketch my way through this picture and tell you the story of my hand. I'd just like to talk a bit about the artwork first. The subject matter is Phoenix and she is a Great Dane. And Phoenix belongs to a lady that works in our local vet surgery and she regularly brings Phoenix with her to work. Now Phoenix is 2 months older than Pip, and when I took the photographs for reference she was only about 8 or 9 months old. So I worked collectively from the 3 photographs, but the picture was inspired by a day that I had gone in and she had waddled over and plonked her head down on the counter at reception, and the look that she gave me just absolutely melted my heart. So I wanted to try and reproduce that with that look that she had in her eyes, because I just thought it would have made an absolutely cracking picture. I'm working on W.H. Smith's sketching paper, which I very much like, which is more than can be said for their watercolour paper, but you already know about that. I'm using an F pencil, a 2B, a 4B and a 6B from various brands. I think one's Derwent and one's a Palomino. The picture took me probably about 16 or 17 hours in total, and I have to say that was at a leisurely pace. If I had just been concentrating every time I sat down, I could probably have done it in maybe 12, but I like to relax. I find the graphite sketches very relaxing and I just like to sort of meander my way through them. You can imagine though the pain and agony I've been through trying to edit this down to fit in with the length of this story. So I've just tried to make sure I've incorporated the key areas when I'm working on the picture so that you can see what I've been doing. All right then, so let's move along to the story. Picture this, a young Jem, well, say younger than I am now. I was in my mid-20s when I decided to go back to school. I decided I wanted to go and get my degree, which was something that I didn't do when I left school. So while I was studying for my degree, which is in Applied Animal Bioscience, that's nice and short and easy to remember, I was working as a farm labourer at my friend's farm, which was great. I absolutely loved it. Plenty of fresh air, sunshine, working with animals. It was awesome. It was a great way to work as a student. And I used to sort of just intermingle various shifts with my lectures, and thankfully, because I was working for a friend, he was really accommodating and very flexible. So I was about 8 weeks, maybe a little bit more than that, before the end of second year. And one of the things that happens when you come to the end of your second year is you have to complete a research project, and they call it a graded unit now, I do believe. And you also have to sit an end of year exam. Now, if you do not pass this exam and you do not pass the graded unit, you do not get qualification to go into your third year, your degree year, and you have to repeat the year. So it was a pretty important time for me at university. And I had been at work one day, all was well, and I went home, and I was living with a boyfriend at the time that wasn't Mr. Jem. This was long before I met Mr. Jem. And I noticed on the side of my middle finger on my left hand, I had like a really tiny bump on my finger. And I thought I've either, like pricked it on something, maybe like a thorn or something like that while I was working, or it felt like a wart was coming up. It wasn't sore, there was no pain attached to it, and the skin wasn't broken, so I wasn't overly concerned. I thought I've maybe just, bumped it or something. So that was fine. Never thought anything of it. A few days later, I went to the pub after university with my boyfriend and a few friends. There was a pub quiz on, we had a lovely night and everything was getting quite sort of merry. And at that time, some of you will notice in my videos, I wear quite a chunky silver ring on my right middle finger. That ring used to live on my left hand, and I had that ring on that night. I kept it on all the time. And as the night wore on, I could feel it getting tight around my finger. Now, the pub was really, really warm that night. It was coming into the summer, and I thought, my hands are swelling up because of the heat. When I woke up the next morning, the only way I can describe it is it looked as if someone had cut a slit in a ping pong ball and stuck it over my knuckle on that hand. My ring was embedded into my finger. and I couldn't bend my finger, and my finger had clawed round and it was almost touching my palm and I couldn't move it. And I looked at it and I was like, oh, this isn't very good. I wasn't in any sort of pain at all. It just that sort of tightness when something's swollen. So I said to my boyfriend, I'm going to have to go to hospital. I've obviously got an infection in it. They'll probably lance it and give me some antibiotics and patch me up, and I'll have to stay, make sure I cover it up for work and stuff for a few days. So that was fine. Drove to the hospital. The hospital's only 15 minutes away for the accident and emergency department, so it wasn't a big deal at all. And sat down and waited, as you do. And I said to my boyfriend, after we've done this, we can go and get some breakfast, because I was quite hungry by that point, and I knew I was going to be waiting about for an hour or two. So triage nurse took me through, and she asked me to explain what had happened. So I told her everything I've just told you guys, and she kind of gave me a funny look, and I don't know whether it was because I was so flippant about it, because it wasn't sore or anything. And she just looked at me and she said, "Take your shirt off." Do you know that? I was like, pardon? What do you mean? She said, "Just take your shirt off, please." So I unbuttoned my shirt, and she took my arm out my sleeve of my left hand, and she pointed with her finger up to my shoulder joint, so where your shoulder joins onto the main part of your body. And she said, "Do you see these little purple lines here?" And I said, "Uh-huh." She said, "That's an infection and it's trying to get to your heart and it's winning. You're going upstairs to a ward right now." And I was just like, oh, okay. And I said to her, I said, I feel fine though. I don't feel unwell. My hand's not really that. So, and she said, "You need to phone someone right now." She said, "Did you drive up yourself?" I said, "Yes." She says, "You need to phone someone right now. They need to bring you an overnight bag and they need to come and pick your car up and take it away," because it was in the short stay car park, right? Which you pay X amount for. And you get a fine if you leave it there longer than it's supposed to be. So I was like, oh, okay. And she said, "This is a lot more serious than you think it is." And she said, "If we don't catch this, you're going to get very, very ill." She says, "You'll end up with sepsis," which is blood poisoning. And she said, it's travelling at an alarming rate. So that was that. I was shipped upstairs to a ward. Now, because they think it was to do with my knuckle joint, I was put in this ward, and it was full of ladies of a slightly older age than me, shall we say, and they had all been in for hip replacements and things like that. So I was sat on the end of this bed waiting for my boyfriend and my parents to bring me, an overnight bag, and I felt like such a fraud sitting there. These ladies had gone through like mega surgery, couldn't walk, couldn't go to the bathroom, nothing. And they're all sat up in bed chatting away to each other. They had this little sort of coven going on, but they were all lovely. And they were like, "Oh, what are you in for?" Because I'm sat at the end of the bed, quite the thing, looking at the picture of, like a good farmer's daughter health, glowy cheeks and a suntan and everything. I was like, "Yeah, I've got a dodgy finger." And they were like, "All right, okay." And I felt awful, honestly. I felt as if I was wasting the NHS's time and money. So I had to wait until the consultant came round, but the nurse had said to me, "I don't want you to eat anything, because I think the doctor's going to want you to go in for surgery like today." And I said to her, I was like, "I haven't had anything to eat all day now." By this point, it's like mid-morning coming into lunchtime. I was starving. And she's like, "Absolutely not. You can drink water, but you're not having anything else." So I was sipping away at water, trying to sort of bag my stomach up while I waited for the consultant. And he came round and he took one look at my hand and one look at my face and said, "How are you with local anaesthetics?" And I said to him, I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And he says, "Are you okay with needles, everything?" I said, "Yep." He said, "Okay, I want to send you down to theatre in the next sort of couple of hours, like the first available slot, because we can't let this go on anymore." And he says, "I'm going to give you a broad spectrum antibiotic IV, like into your veins just now," he said, "because we have to stop this infection." And I was like, right, oh, okay. So down I toddled. They were going to put me in a wheelchair and take me down to to the operating theatre. And I was like, "Guys, I can walk, it's fine." So I went down. The surgeon was lovely. He was a hand specialist. I didn't know you had hand specialist surgeons, but apparently that's all he does. And he said to me, he said, "It's obviously some kind of fluid build-up." So he said, "We're just going to drain it for you, wash it out to make sure that there's no like local infection, and if there is, we'll make sure we flush it out and give you some antibiotic in it, and we'll just stitch you back up." So I'm like, "Oh yeah, great." And he says, "Yep, you'll be in and out in a couple of hours." He says, "You might feel a bit under the weather for a day or two because obviously this infection has started to spread in your body." And he says, "It'll be like flu-like symptoms." You'll have to stay off work for a week to let your finger heal up, and you can be on your merry way. So I was like, fantastic, thanks very much. Couple hours in surgery, got out, no problem at all. Finally got something to eat. Oh my God, I've never enjoyed a piece of dry toast so much in my entire life. That evening, I had to sleep with my arm elevated, and their very technical solution to this was to attach a fabric sling to an IV drip stand. Now, that's one of the tall, thin stands on the wheels that have got the hook on the end that they put the little bags on. So I'm lying in this hospital bed with my left arm flung out the side, up in the air in this sling. You can imagine the mechanics of trying to get to sleep. It just wasn't happening. It was awful. So I didn't get any sleep. I must have nodded off at some point though, and I woke up in the morning and I swear down blind, I felt as if I had been run over by a bus. I felt horrendous. Not under the weather, not a bit groggy. I felt horrendous. And I just thought to myself, oh my, like something doesn't feel right. Like, I was aware that I'd had surgery. My hand was going to be sore. Everything hurt. My entire body was aching and I couldn't get comfortable. Every time I turned over, all my joints were aching and sore. And I said to the nurse when she came round first thing, she asked me how I was and gave me some pain relief, which was awesome. And I said to her, I've never felt this awful, like, in my entire life. And she said, well, you're going to have to wait for the consultant to come round and he's going to take a look at your hand and we'll go from there. So the consultant came round and my hand was all bandaged up. I looked like a boxer, I had all this huge bandage. So I lifted it down out the sling and he started to unwrap the bandages and he's saying, how are you feeling? And I said, I don't feel well. I don't feel good at all. And he said, well, that's to be expected, but let's have a look at your hand. So he undid the bandages and he went, oh. And I thought, well, that's great, isn't it? And I was like, that doesn't sound like a good oh. And he said, well, clearly there's a lot more going on than we thought. Now, when I looked at my hand, they had made an incision down the left-hand side of that middle finger, right where the bump was originally. And they'd basically split it from my knuckle back up to my hand. So it was, it was a couple of inches long. But not only was my finger swollen, the rest of my fingers had swollen up like sausages, and the back part of my hand was about 3 times the size it should be. I couldn't move my fingers. Basically, it looks as if someone had blown my hand up. Like, the way you would like blow into a rubber glove to blow it? That's what my hand looked like. And he said, this infection's obviously quite deep-seated and it's starting to attack your tendons in your hand. Now, your tendons that run up over your knuckles over the back of your hand, if you splay your hand out and wiggle your fingers, you can usually see them moving about. They are encased in a sort of tube-like structure, and that's to protect them. And these tubes had basically filled up with fluid, and this was my body's way of trying to protect my tendons from this infection and also from the trauma of the surgery. And I was like, oh, that's not cool at all. And he said to me, is that your dominant hand? And I said, yes. And he went, okay, this isn't good. He said, I don't know whether we're getting the infection under control, because I told him I wasn't feeling well, etc. And he says, your hand is just not good at all. You'll need to go back to surgery. And do you know, that way I was just like, can this actually get any worse at all? Knowing in the back of my head that I had an exam to study for and I had this research project to do at uni. And I said to him, what's the likelihood of me actually getting sorted? And he said, well, you'll just have to go back into theatre and we'll see how it goes. So that same night, this is how urgent it was. The consultant saw me at like 10:30 in the morning and he got me into theatre at 9:30 that night. It was a Friday night, and most operating theatres, the surgeons don't work on the weekends. It's like business hours almost. So the poor surgeon must have been cursing me. He thought he was going home for a nice glass of wine with his wife and put his feet up, but no, there's Jem coming in with her big bloated hand to ruin his evening. So one of the problems that I have with general anaesthetic is that I have a tendency to wake up early, and it's something that I've noticed with other drugs as well. Whatever it is, for some reason, I don't seem to metabolize drugs the same way other people do. Painkillers have virtually no effect on me. They don't do anything. And when I've had surgery under general anaesthetic previously, I have woken up early, and it is the most horrendous and traumatic experience of your life, because when you come round from anaesthesia, you are supposed to be in a bed in a recovery room and have been administered pain relief before you wake up, so that when you wake up you're reasonably comfortable. The last time that I'd had a general anaesthetic, I woke up being manhandled from the operating table onto a gurney, and I had not had any pain medication administered. So I basically woke up in raw surgery with people trying to like move my arms and legs onto a bed, and I found that very, very, very stressful. So I'd made the doctor aware of this, and I said to him, I was like, if you're going to put me under general anaesthetic, please give me more than you need, because this is what happened before and I am not prepared to go through that again. And he said, absolutely fine, no problem. Took me to surgery. I said goodnight to the anaesthetist when he was putting me under. And I woke up cosy and warm in a recovery room with a nurse standing beside me. And just as an aside, one of the really funny things about general anaesthetic is when you wake up, you start talking a load of nonsense. And I was rabbiting away to this nurse about my cows. She must have just thought, oh, here we go again. So anyway, the doctor had said that everything went okay. And they had drained all the fluid from my tendons and one thing and another. And they'd had a poke about, and there didn't seem to be much damage. They had to take away a little bit of the muscle and the tissue in my finger, and they found the source of the infection, and everything was going to be okay. So I was like, yes, this is great. So once I was a bit more compos mentis, this was really late on at night, the nurse had said to me, she's like, as far as we know, everything's gone fine, back up to the ward, and the consultant will come round first thing in the morning and speak to you about what's been done. So that was okay. So I was still pretty groggy, and I fully expected to just sort of, like conk out and wake up the next morning and for my hand to feel as if someone had like squashed it with a hammer. And I woke up the next morning and that's exactly the way that I felt, but I still had these horrible flu symptoms, and I was like sweating, and like my vision was blurred and stuff, and I was almost at the stage where I was hallucinating, but I don't know whether that was tiredness or the drugs, or it could have been anything. The consultant came to see me at 7:30 the next morning, and he said to me, we fixed your hand, everything's going to be fine. He said, I don't know how much permanent damage you're going to have to your hand, because we had to do a fair bit of digging about, in the tendons in the back of your hand and in your finger. He said, I'm more concerned about making sure that we've got this infection under control, because it was all the way up my arm and, into my trunk. So he said the flu symptoms might continue, but we're giving you really strong antibiotics, and we're also going to give you really strong pain relief as well for your hand. Again, back to the previous conversation about not metabolising drugs properly. I also found out after that my grandfather on my dad's side, which is my Italian grandfather, he died of bowel cancer, and when he was at home in his last, week or so of life, the doctors were basically just giving him as much pain medication as he needed, and told my father that it would probably be an overdose on the painkiller that would kill him rather than the cancer. And he was amazed at the volume of painkillers my grandfather was taking, and he was still lucid. And he's saying to my dad, like, that's like enough painkillers to like down a horse, and your dad's like sitting up in bed and talking and stuff. So I don't know, maybe it's a genetic thing. Anyway, I'm totally getting off the subject here. So they gave me lots of pain relief, like absolutely buckets of the stuff. I was absolutely high as a kite for about 3 days in hospital, I kid you not. And when people were coming to visit me, bar the fact that my hand was an absolute mess and my arm was all bruised, I was sat up chatting to folk and all that, and everyone's like, how are you doing? I'm like, yeah, great, this is awesome, I'm going to get out of hospital in a day or two, blah, blah, blah. No, just no. Over optimistic. 3 or 4 nights, I can't actually remember the exact timing of this because I was absolutely out of my tree most of the time. But there was one night, I was starting to feel a bit better, and I was quite optimistic that I was getting home. And I woke up during the night. Now, by this point, I was wise to the nurses. See the whole arm in the sling thing? I was waiting until the nurses had done their rounds, and then I was pulling out the sling and tucking it into my chest and covering it up with my right arm. And it's kind of like just a gut reaction. It's like a protective thing, because I wanted to make sure it didn't get bumped or, because even if someone touched it, I was like, oh my God. So I was doing that periodically, and it's just so that I could get like little cat naps in without having my arm hanging out the side of this hospital bed. But I woke up during the night and I thought that someone had come into the ward to my bed in the middle of the night and had started surgery on my stomach without telling me. I felt as if I was being stabbed repeatedly in the gut. These really, really sharp pains. Now, one of the things about the ward was that being in with a lot of older women who had had hip surgery, they were obviously struggling to get a good night's sleep. And the nurse's station was right outside the ward. So rather than ring the little bell, to get someone to come and see you, my legs worked. There was nothing wrong with my legs. I thought I'll get out of bed and I'll go round to the nurse's station and just tell them that I've got a really sore stomach. I made it out of the bed and onto my hands and knees on the floor of the ward beside the bed, and that was as far as I got. And I stayed there for maybe, 10 or 15 minutes, trying not to make any noise because I didn't want to wake these poor women up that had actually managed to nod off. And the nurse found me there on the floor and she said, "Gemma, what's wrong?" I was like, "I don't know, but my stomach, I can't even like undouble myself up off the floor. It's that painful." And she just said straight away, "I'm going to get the doctor." So the doctor came. Because of the massive concoction of painkillers and other drugs that they had given me, it basically destroyed the lining of my stomach and my whole digestive system was shot. For about 4 hours after that, I brought up nothing but bile, which was full of blood and other horrible things that you just would never want to see in your life. And it's pretty scary when you see it coming out your own body. You're like, oh, that's not good. So that was like an added complication. And obviously my immune system was completely shot and my body wasn't functioning properly anymore. It was trying to deal with the trauma from the 2 surgeries on my hand and the infection and now this stomach problem. And basically, to cut a very long story a bit shorter, I ended up in hospital for nearly a fortnight. I got secondary infections, and this was where my IV lines were going in because by this point I was like a pincushion. They could no longer use my left arm because it was in a hell of a mess. And they went over to my right arm, and I had 4 or 5 puncture sites in my right arm, 3 of which got infected. Again, body immune system nil. And so as the sort of first week dragged into the second week, I started to become very depressed, very withdrawn, knew that I was going to fail my second year of university because I was falling further and further behind. Because I was on so many drugs, I wasn't, my brain wasn't clear enough, I wasn't lucid enough to sit and even study. That was never going to happen. And this lady was brought into the ward, and I had seen a few people come and go by this point. And this lady was brought into the ward, and bless her, she'd fallen, and they think it was a suspected broken hip, which was why she'd been brought in. But she had no feeling from her waist down, and you can imagine the types of thing that poor woman went through. And she had previously, when she was very independent, for an older lady, I think she was well into her 80s, but she'd lived by herself, and all of a sudden she couldn't even stand up. And she was in the bed next to me, and I felt terrible for her because she had no privacy. They swing a curtain round when they're doing stuff with her, but I was in the bed next to her. I could see, hear and smell everything, and that made my situation so much worse. But I felt so bad for this woman that they didn't have a private room to put her in. And it got to the point where I stopped eating. I had no appetite anyway. I was on so many drugs. I was like, oh. And one of the male nurses that was looking after that ward, his name was Colin, and I will never forget him for as long as I live. And he came in, and I was feeling so sorry for myself. And I'd turned my back to the ward because I was in this bed next to the window at this point. And I had a little cry to myself, and I didn't want anyone to see me crying. I didn't want to draw any attention to myself, so I just turned over. And the next thing, the shadow of Colin came round the corner of the bed, and he crouched down beside me. And he said to me, "I know that you're not doing well," he says, "because you haven't touched any food." And he said, "I know that you like your food." So of course that made me laugh because I'm a greedy pig, yeah. And he said to me, if you need someone to talk to, he says being in hospital and being ill isn't always about the physical signs. He says mentally as well. So he says if you want someone to talk to, you just come and talk to me. And I thought, do you know, that way it made me feel, because I felt quite isolated before that, and it made me feel as if I wasn't alone. And Colin was absolutely amazing. He was such a good guy. And he was the first person to help me put my bra on when I was feeling a bit better. But that's a story for another time. Anyway, I asked him and I said, look, I don't want to cause any fuss or any trouble, but there was an empty bed at the other end of the ward. Away from this poor woman, and I said to him, I said, I think it would be better for both of us if I could move to the other side of the ward, because this lady, like, she has no privacy kind of thing, and it's kind of dragging me down as well. And within 10 minutes, they don't actually like switch you over. They just take the brakes off the beds and swap the beds over. I thought they would have like made up the bed and, you know, stripped my, no, they just switched us around. They're like, there you go, that's. And I was like, oh, this is great. So that made me feel slightly better in myself. The pain levels in my arm were excruciating, and my general health was still very, very poor, but that kind of like bumped me up a little bit. The drugs that they were giving me had some really weird side effects. At one point I was genuinely like 100% hallucinating. I had no idea who'd been to visit me. And apparently I told my mum that someone who is deceased had come to visit me. So yeah, that would, I don't know. I wish someone had like videoed all that. One of the drugs that they gave me a really heavy aversion to bright light. That was just one of the side effects of the drugs. And that kind of caused me a bit of bother as well. So I spent quite a lot of time actually under the blanket as well. So I got to the point where the nurses said to me, you know, you're good to kind of get up and walk about. And this was coming on nearly 2 weeks in hospital now, and things were starting to get under control, and the infection was under control, and I was feeling a little bit better. So Colin helped me get washed and helped me get dressed, which was it was actually quite nice to be able to have like a proper shower with a plastic bag over my arm. And I did, like, he brushed my hair for me and stuff, and one of the ladies put my hair in a French pleat for me, which was adorable. That was so nice of her. And I took myself off for a walk round the hospital, and it was the weirdest thing, because I hadn't seen anyone people in any sort of volumes for nearly 2 weeks. And I was still a bit kind of like, wobbly and stuff. So I was like floating about the hospital with this arm clutched into my chest to be, in case someone banged it or bumped it. I'd like pulled it right in. And afterwards I thought, God, I wonder what people thought of me wandering about. And I ended up in the hospital chapel. And for the next few nights when I couldn't sleep, I just went down and sat there, and it was a very lovely and peaceful place to be. They don't call it a chapel, it's a worship room. It's non-denominational, but it's chapel. And that kind of helped with my mental state as well, and I was really glad of that. So eventually, finally, the day came where the doctor said to me, we're going to let you go home. We think you're well enough to go home. And I have never been so happy and upset at the same time. I was so depressed by this point. I couldn't feel my hand at all. Like, I couldn't feel anything in it. I could move my arm, but I couldn't feel my hand. And I had been confined for these 2 weeks. Now, bearing in mind I'm a person that's used to being outside in the fresh air and doing physical work, I literally did not know what to do with myself. And this aversion to bright light did not help either. My dad took me home that day, and it was the most bizarre experience of my life. It was almost like I was experiencing the first time I'd been out in the world. And it was just so odd. And it took me ages, and I mean ages, to get over this. And not in the physical sense. It was 3 weeks before I went out in public, and it was my friend that took me out and said, it's a nice day, we're going to walk into town and we're going to go for a beer. And I was like, I'm not drinking any beer. I've been on hundreds of drugs and my stomach's ruined. There was no alcohol for me, but that was fine. And even I was frightened to go outside. And if he hadn't been with me, I wouldn't have gone. It's as simple as that. So now here we are. I am a week from my exam. My research project, I have been banished from the lab because it turns out the infection that I had was indeed a bacterial infection. And guess what I was working with in the lab for my research product? You got it. Bacteria. So the final stages of my research project, I had to stand at the door and wistfully look in through the little round glass window at my lab partners finishing off our project and the finished product of the bacterial experiment. I was not allowed back in the lab. It was just like a massive no-no. I then had to go back during the summer months and repeat the same research experiment and produce the same bacteria to prove that I could do it, otherwise I wouldn't pass. I really didn't give a monkeys about that, I'll be honest, because I knew I could redo it. I was concerned about my exam. I had missed so much. It was probably about 2 weeks after I'd got home that I was fit enough to actually sit and study properly, and I had the concentration span for it. I still couldn't write at that point, but that was the least of my worries. There was a pass mark for the exam. I can't remember what it was. It was a number of years ago now. And I was so worried about it because if I didn't pass that exam, I wasn't getting into third year. It's as simple as that. I wasn't getting into my degree year. So the exam rolled round. I did my best and I found that my brain was still really foggy with a lot of things, and I seemed to have lost a lot of what I had learned. It just disappeared. And I came out of that exam absolutely just deflated, and I just resigned myself to the fact that I'd missed too much. I hadn't done enough once I was better, and I was probably going to have to resit. I had to wait a week for the results for that. It was the most painful week of my life. I passed by 2 marks. 2 marks was the difference between me going into my degree year with all of my friends or having to reset the year. Now, interestingly, I think there's some sort of karma or forces at work, because if I had not passed that exam and I had not gone into third year, I would never have met Mr. Jem, because it was in my third year that I met him. So there you are. You can think about that all you want. So now here we are. Obviously, I recovered eventually, and what I am left with now is still an aversion to bright light. I hate bright light. I'm okay if I've got sunglasses on. I like being out in the sun. That it's just an after effect. It's never gone away. And my hand, I have a scar that's probably about 1 inch long down the left hand side of my finger on my left hand, which of course is my drawing hand, and a slightly misshapen finger. So that is why I now wear that silver ring on my right hand, because it doesn't fit on my left finger anymore because it's too fat. But when you look at that scar, it looks so insignificant, and you would never think that I went through everything that I went through when it actually happened. That all came from this tiny little bump. Now I have no feeling in that middle finger. I don't feel temperature and I can't feel pressure. However, I do still have the full motor function. I can wiggle it about, no problem. I sometimes get pins and needles and cramps up my tendons, and that's what makes my hand shake. And some of you might have heard me mention that there's some days where I've wanted to draw and my hand's just been too shaky, and when that happens I like to colour instead because it's a bit easier on my hand. So that's basically what I've been left with, and it's not debilitating. I was worried that I might not be able to draw or write or do anything, and that's not the case. It is more an inconvenience rather than anything else, and it's something that I've just got used to over the years now, that the fact that I can't feel my middle finger. Now, a number of weeks ago, I'm sure some of you noticed, I had injured my middle finger on that hand, and I had it covered up as well because it was pretty disgusting. So yeah, what happened with that was, because that finger is numb and I can't feel anything in it, I had gone to pick up my new laptop, and it was quite a drive. While I was driving, the car wasn't driving right, and when I stopped, I realised that I think the brakes were stuck on. Now, one of the ways to tell if your brakes have been sticking is you will feel heat. If you put your hand near the wheel, never touch it, never ever ever touch your wheel. But if you put your hand near the wheel, you can sometimes feel heat coming from the brake discs. Now, the wheels of my car are like big spoke alloys. So I put my hand next to that to see if I could feel any heat coming off. And I didn't realise that my middle finger was touching the brake disc, which, by the way, was absolutely boiling hot. And I didn't realise until I pulled my hand away and I could smell something cooking and I realised it was my finger. So yeah, that silly things like that can happen, and it was an absolute mess. And you'll see now it's healed up okay now, but I didn't feel any of that. I literally did not feel any of it, and it's quite dangerous because you can do things to your finger and you don't realise that you're injuring yourself. It did happen once before, not long after I'd had my surgery and I was kind of healed up, and it was a metal teapot, and I was pouring tea, but I didn't realise that my middle finger was touching the body of the teapot, and it blistered, and I was like, oh, where did that blister come from? So it's kind of funny now, but it just goes to show you that horrendous things can happen from something that you think is quite insignificant. And to be told that you're basically on your way to blood poisoning and to end up as ill as I was when I am like a strapping, healthy person, that's quite scary. I would love to hear your views on this story, or if you have a good injury story. I love good injury stories. I would love to hear them in the comments. And as you can see here now, we're getting finished up with Phoenix, and isn't she just the most adorable thing you have ever seen? I really enjoyed doing this picture. I enjoy drawing animals anyway, as you guys know. And I'm glad I really took my time with this because it's turned out quite well and I'm quite proud of it. So I would love to hear if you have any comments or anything like that about the picture as well. I hope you have enjoyed this slightly grisly story and haven't put any of you off your foot. In fact, I'm going to put a warning in at the start of this video just in case anybody's squeamish. Thank you so much for listening, guys, and I hope that you've enjoyed the whole video, the drawing as well as the talking, and we'll see you back in the cave really soon for another video. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.